The Mexican-American War didn't erupt overnight. It was the product of decades of tension, shifting borders, and promises that collapsed under the weight of ambition. To understand how the conflict began, you have to picture North America in the early 1800s, a vast, unsettled landscape where lines on a map often meant less than the determination of settlers and governments to redraw them. Mexico, after breaking free from Spain in 1821, inherited a massive stretch of territory stretching from California down to Central America. But this new republic faced a fragile start. Political instability, regional rivalries, and weak central authority plagued it from the beginning. Meanwhile, the United States was riding a wave of confidence, powered by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to expand across the continent. That belief wasn't just an abstract philosophy. It was a rallying cry that fueled aggressive land grabs and diplomatic maneuvering. One of the flashpoints was Texas. In the 1820s, Mexico invited American settlers into Texas to help populate and defend its northern frontier. But what started as a solution quickly turned into a problem. The settlers, known as Texians, brought with them cultural traditions and political expectations that clashed with Mexican law. They also brought enslaved people, which Mexico had outlawed. Tensions spiraled until 1836, when Texas declared independence. Mexico never recognized this breakaway republic, and for the next decade, the borderlands simmered with hostility. The United States, however, saw Texas as a prize. Many in Washington wanted annexation, not only for its fertile land, but also as a step toward continental expansion. When Texas finally joined the Union in 1845, it was more than a political move. It was a direct challenge to Mexico. To make matters worse, the U.S. and Mexico disagreed over where the border actually lay. The U.S. claimed it was the Rio Grande. Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, farther north. Between those two rivers stretched a disputed zone, and both sides saw it as their own. President James K. Polk entered office determined to expand U.S. territory even further. Polk was a firm believer in manifest destiny, and he had his eye not just on Texas, but also on California and New Mexico. He sent envoys to Mexico with offers to purchase land, offers that were flatly rejected. To Polk, diplomacy failing meant justification for stronger measures. In 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary to move U.S. troops into the disputed zone between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. For Mexico, this was nothing short of provocation. When Mexican cavalry clashed with Taylor's forces, Polk seized on the event. He declared to Congress that American blood had been spilled on American soil, a controversial but effective claim that rallied support for war. Behind the politics were human stories of unease and distrust. Mexican citizens viewed the U.S. not just as a neighbor, but as an encroaching power eager to strip their nation of land. Americans, meanwhile, were divided. Expansionists cheered the prospect of gaining new territory, but critics, including a young Abraham Lincoln, challenged Polk's narrative, calling it a war of aggression. Even Henry David Thoreau went so far as to refuse paying taxes in protest, later writing his famous essay on civil disobedience. The spark had been lit. War was declared in May 1846, and both sides prepared for a struggle that would reshape the continent. For Mexico, it was a fight to defend sovereignty and honor. For the United States, it was a chance to fulfill what many saw as destiny. But as the first shots rang out, neither side could predict how brutal or transformative the conflict would become. The disputed borderlands were just the beginning. California, New Mexico, and even Mexico's capital would soon become battlegrounds. And while Polk's ambitions seemed clear, the true cost of expansion was about to be revealed on the fields of war. The opening battles of the Mexican-American War were anything but minor skirmishes. Once the U.S. Congress declared war in May 1846, the conflict escalated with startling speed. General Zachary Taylor, stationed in the contested zone along the Rio Grande, quickly became the face of America's early campaigns. His small but disciplined army clashed with Mexican troops in battles that would capture national attention and propel Taylor toward future fame. The first significant confrontation was at Palo Alto on May 8, 1846. Taylor's forces, though outnumbered, wielded superior artillery, light, mobile cannons that shredded the advancing Mexican lines. The next day at Resaca de la Palma, the U.S. struck again. This time, close-quarter fighting pushed Mexican soldiers into a chaotic retreat across the Rio Grande. For Americans, the victories seemed to confirm their belief in manifest destiny, while for Mexico, the defeats were bitter reminders of internal weakness and disorganization. But the war wasn't confined to Texas. Even as Taylor fought in the north, U.S. forces eyed Mexico's far-flung provinces. California, sparsely populated but strategically priceless, became a prime target. In June 1846, American settlers in California staged the so-called Bear Flag Revolt, declaring independence from Mexico. The movement might have fizzled if not for U.S. naval forces swiftly seizing key ports like Monterey and San Francisco. By summer's end, California was firmly in American hands, though guerrilla resistance lingered. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, General Stephen Kearny led the Army of the West across the desert, marching into Santa Fe without firing a shot. The territory surrendered almost immediately, demonstrating how fragile Mexico's hold was over its northern lands. Still, the ease of conquest masked simmering resentment. In early 1847, local rebels in Taos launched a bloody uprising that killed the newly appointed U.S. governor before being crushed. The quick succession of victories gave the impression of an unstoppable American machine, but the reality on the ground was more complicated. Soldiers faced scorching heat, disease, and supply shortages. Many volunteers were poorly trained, and discipline often broke down. Reports of atrocities, including looting and mistreatment of civilians, began to circulate, tarnishing the image of a clean, noble campaign. On the Mexican side, morale was fragile but not broken. The army was plagued by poor leadership and outdated tactics, yet many soldiers fought with tenacity, born of defending their homeland. The defeats fueled anger at the Mexican government, which was already crippled by political instability. The return of Antonio López de Santa Anna, yes, the same general who had led Mexico during the Texas Revolution, added fresh intrigue. Exiled in Cuba, Santa Anna struck a deal with Polk, promising to negotiate peace if allowed back into Mexico. Instead, once he returned, he seized power and vowed to drive the invaders out. Santa Anna's reappearance gave the Mexican people a rallying figure, though his reputation was as much about self-interest as patriotism. Still, it set the stage for a brutal new phase of the war. Taylor's army, emboldened by early victories, marched deeper into Mexican territory. At Monterey in September 1846, they fought house to house in bloody urban combat. Though Mexico surrendered the city, the defenders' stubborn resistance showed that the war would not be won quickly. Taylor's most famous battle came at Buena Vista in February 1847. Outnumbered by Santa Anna's massive force, the Americans seemed on the brink of disaster. Yet Taylor's use of artillery and clever positioning allowed his troops to hold the line. When Santa Anna suddenly withdrew, some say due to supply shortages and political pressures, Taylor emerged as a national hero. Newspapers back home praised him as a simple, rugged soldier who had defied overwhelming odds. But while Taylor was basking in glory, President Polk worried. Taylor's popularity made him a political threat, especially since Polk's own Democratic Party was divided over the war. To keep control, Polk shifted focus to a new campaign aimed straight at the heart of Mexico. It would be led by General Winfield Scott, whose disciplined professionalism was a stark contrast to Taylor's rough-hewn style. By early 1847, The war had spread from dusty border towns to Mexico's heartland, and the stakes were rising. The U.S. had gained ground, but the conflict was far from over. Mexico's political turmoil, Santa Anna's unpredictable leadership, and the sheer difficulty of marching an army deep into hostile territory meant that the true test still lay ahead. The early battles had shown America's firepower and ambition, but what came next would reveal just how costly that ambition could become, because invading the capital of a proud and desperate nation was no simple feat. By 1847, the war had entered a dangerous new phase. The border skirmishes and frontier revolts were behind them. Now, the United States was preparing to strike at the very core of Mexico. President James K. Polk, unsatisfied with victories in California, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, wanted nothing less than a march into the heartland to force a final surrender. The man chosen to lead this high-stakes gamble was General Winfield Scott, a polished, methodical commander nicknamed Old Fuss and Feathers for his obsession with discipline and military order. Scott's plan was bold: an amphibious invasion at Veracruz, followed by a march inland to Mexico City. It was a strategy that echoed European campaigns, something unheard of in the Americas at the time. In March 1847, the U.S. launched the largest amphibious operation in its history up to that point. Naval warships bombarded Veracruz, while thousands of soldiers poured ashore in a remarkably smooth landing. Within weeks, the city capitulated, giving Scott a crucial base for the push toward Mexico's capital. But the road to Mexico City was anything but easy. The route wound through treacherous terrain, narrow mountain passes, volcanic ridges, and valleys perfect for ambushes. Santa Anna, now firmly back in control of Mexico's armies, took advantage of the land he knew so well. He rallied his troops to intercept Scott at Cerro Gordo, where steep cliffs and fortified positions seemed to give Mexico the upper hand. Yet Scott, with careful reconnaissance and daring maneuvers, outflanked the Mexican army. The result was a devastating defeat for Santa Anna, who barely escaped with his life. As American troops pressed forward, the war grew increasingly brutal. Diseases like yellow fever and dysentery claimed more lives than enemy fire. Soldiers wrote home about the harsh marches, the lack of clean water, and the constant threat of ambush. Mexican civilians, caught in the crossfire, often suffered the most. Looting, forced requisition of supplies, and acts of cruelty turned public sentiment in Mexico even fiercer against the invaders. Resistance fighters harassed U.S. supply lines, creating a shadow war alongside the pitched battles. Despite these challenges, Scott's campaign maintained momentum. At Contreras and Churubusco, just outside Mexico City, his forces faced some of the fiercest fighting yet. Mexican soldiers fought with desperate courage, especially the famed San Patricio Battalion, a group of mostly Irish immigrants who had deserted from the U.S. Army and joined Mexico, driven by sympathy for Catholic compatriots and resentment of mistreatment in American ranks. Their stand became legendary, but the battles ended with another series of American victories. The defeats sparked chaos in Mexico's government. Political factions tore at each other, unable to unite behind a clear strategy. Santa Anna's leadership was questioned at every turn, and his opportunism only deepened mistrust. For the common Mexican soldier, the war had become a grim test of endurance, facing shortages of food, outdated weapons, and the crushing reality of repeated losses. Yet still, they fought on, determined to defend their homeland. Back in the United States, reactions were mixed. Many celebrated the victories and territorial gains, but critics grew louder. Newspapers printed graphic accounts of battlefield carnage and atrocities against civilians. Anti-war voices in Congress accused Polk of provoking the conflict for land and power. Even within the army, discontent spread as volunteers, who had enlisted for quick glory, found themselves mired in prolonged hardship. As Scott drew closer to Mexico City, tension reached its peak. The capital was not just another military target, it was the symbolic heart of the Mexican nation. To take it would mean humiliation for Mexico, but to fail would embolden resistance and potentially drag the war out for years. The battles ahead would decide not only the war's outcome, but also the future shape of the continent. Scots soldiers, weary but hardened, braced themselves. They knew that storming the gates of Mexico's capital would be their ultimate challenge, and the world was watching to see if the United States could truly conquer one of the oldest and proudest cities in the Americas. But as the troops approached the city's defenses, they were about to face some of the most shocking and dramatic moments of the entire war. Scenes that would forever mark the turning point of Mexico's struggle for survival. The final act of the Mexican-American War unfolded on the doorstep of Mexico City, a city steeped in centuries of history, perched on a plateau nearly 7,000 feet above sea level, and protected by natural barriers and man-made defenses. To capture it would be no ordinary victory. It would mean striking at the very heart of the Mexican nation. For General Winfield Scott and his weary soldiers, the road had led to this climactic moment. In August 1847, Scott's army approached the capital from the south, facing a formidable defensive line anchored by the fortress of Chapultepec and a network of causeways, canals, and fortified positions. The geography itself was an ally to the defenders. Santa Anna, though battered by earlier defeats, gathered tens of thousands of troops in a last-ditch effort to repel the invaders. For Mexico, this was more than a military stand. It was a fight for national survival. The battles that followed were fierce and chaotic. At Molino del Rey, American forces assaulted a suspected cannon foundry, only to find themselves caught in a deadly trap. Mexican defenders poured musket and artillery fire into the attackers, and for hours the outcome hung in the balance. Though the U.S. eventually secured the field, it came at a staggering cost, with some of the heaviest American casualties of the war. The Pyrrhic victory underscored how determined Mexico remained, even in the face of long odds. Then came Chapultepec, the most iconic battle of the war. The fortress, perched atop a rocky hill overlooking the city, stood as both a military stronghold and a symbol of Mexican pride. On September 13th, American troops stormed the slopes under withering fire. Among the defenders were cadets from the Mexican Military Academy, teenagers who refused to abandon their posts. Their desperate courage became legend, especially the story of Juan Escutia, said to have wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leapt from the walls rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Though Chapultepec fell, the sacrifice of these Niños Héroes, or boy heroes, became a lasting symbol of Mexican patriotism. With Chapultepec captured, the road into Mexico City lay open. American troops advanced along the causeways, encountering pockets of resistance and barricades at every turn. By September 14th, U.S. forces marched into the city center, raising the stars and stripes over the National Palace. For the first time in its history, Mexico's capital had fallen to a foreign power. The humiliation was devastating. Santa Anna fled, his reputation ruined, while Mexico's government teetered on collapse. Yet victory came with unease. American soldiers faced ongoing resistance from civilians and guerrilla fighters who struck from alleys and rooftops. Occupying a hostile city proved nearly as dangerous as the battles that preceded it. Reports of atrocities, theft, and violent reprisals circulated widely, staining what Polk had hoped would be a clean, decisive triumph. Still, the war's outcome was effectively sealed. In February 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Mexico was forced to cede more than half its territory, land that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In return, the U.S. paid $15 million and assumed some of Mexico's debts, a sum widely viewed as paltry compared to the vastness of the territory gained. The consequences were immense. For the United States, the victory fulfilled the dream of manifest destiny, extending its reach from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The new lands promised wealth, resources, and opportunities, but also reignited fierce debates over slavery, debates that would soon push the nation toward civil war. For Mexico, the defeat was catastrophic, a wound to national pride and a reminder of deep political divisions. The memory of foreign occupation lingered, shaping Mexican identity and fueling suspicion of its northern neighbor for generations. In the aftermath, generals like Zachary and Winfield returned home as heroes, their reputations paving the way to political careers. Soldiers carried with them both glory and trauma, their stories mixing pride in victory with haunting memories of hardship and loss. For the people of Mexico, the war became a story not of defeat, but of resistance and sacrifice, embodied in the legend of the Niños Héroes and countless unnamed fighters who refused to surrender their homeland without a fight. The Mexican-American War was short in duration, just under 2 years, but long in consequence. It redrew the map of North America, set the stage for future conflicts, and left scars still felt today. The fall of Mexico City was not just the end of a war. It was the birth of a new, uneasy era between two nations whose histories would remain forever intertwined. Looking back, the Mexican-American War was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of ideals, ambitions, and national identities. For the United States, it symbolized the bold march of manifest destiny, the belief that expansion was both inevitable and justified. Yet beneath the surface of triumph lay uncomfortable truths. The war was controversial, its justifications questioned even at the time, and its outcomes tangled in the moral and political storm of slavery. For Mexico, the war was a devastating blow, stripping away not just land, but also confidence in its young republic. But out of that pain emerged stories of resilience, symbols of defiance, and a determination to rebuild. The Niños Héroes, the guerrilla fighters, and ordinary citizens who resisted occupation became part of a national narrative that continues to shape Mexico's sense of identity. The war also reshaped the relationship between the two nations. It established the U.S. as a continental power, but at the cost of fostering deep mistrust across the border. Even today, echoes of that history linger in politics, culture, and the complicated bond between neighbors. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Mexican-American War is that expansion and conquest carry costs beyond territory and treaties. They leave behind legacies of bitterness, pride, and unanswered questions. Was the war a bold step forward for one nation, or a tragedy of loss for another? The truth is, it was both, and that's why the story of the Mexican-American War continues to resonate. It's not just history, it's a reminder of how ambition, conflict, and human determination can shape entire continents in ways that last far beyond the battlefield.